The air was cold, biting, and unrelenting as a heavy blanket of snow covered the small town of Maplewood. James Carter trudged through the icy streets, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing night. His coat was zipped tight, but it wasn't enough to keep out the chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. Maplewood was quiet, the streets almost deserted except for a few distant lights flickering in windows. It was a night when most people stayed indoors, wrapped in warm blankets with cups of cocoa. But James wasn't like most people. He had always loved late-night walks, even in weather like this. It gave him time to think, to reflect on his life, and to clear his mind. Tonight, however, his thoughts were heavy. A recent layoff from his construction job and mounting bills weighed him down. James's life felt like it was spinning out of control, and he couldn't find the brakes. As he walked past the park, something unusual caught his attention. A faint whimpering sound pierced through the stillness of the night. James stopped in his tracks, his ears straining to locate the source of the sound. The whimpering grew louder, more desperate. It was coming from a snowbank near the edge of the park. His heart quickened as he approached the mound of snow. He knelt down, brushing away the powdery white layers with his gloved hands. To his shock, he uncovered a tiny, trembling puppy, its fur matted with ice and snow. The poor creature looked up at him with pleading eyes, its body shivering uncontrollably. "Oh, you poor thing," James murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He gently scooped up the puppy, cradling it close to his chest. The little animal was so cold it felt like holding a block of ice. James's heart ached as he realized how close the puppy must have been to freezing to death. Without a second thought, he zipped the puppy inside his coat, letting his own body heat warm the tiny creature. "You're safe now," he whispered, standing up and heading back toward his small apartment. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that finding the puppy wasn't a coincidence. It felt like fate had placed a tiny life in his hands. But James had no idea that this rescue was just the beginning of something far more extraordinary. Back in his apartment, James set about warming the puppy. He wrapped it in a soft towel and placed it near the radiator. The little dog's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time, James saw a flicker of life return to its gaze. He smiled, feeling a rare warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the radiator. "You're a fighter, who?" he said, stroking the puppy's head gently. As the puppy warmed up, James noticed something peculiar. Around its neck was a small, leather collar that looked old and worn. Attached to it was a tiny, rusted metal tag. James squinted at the tag, trying to make out the faded engraving. The letters were barely legible, but after a few moments, he could decipher them. Hope and what appeared to be a partial address. The name Hope tugged at his heartstrings. It was fitting, he thought, given the circumstances. But the address puzzled him. It wasn't a complete one, just a street name, Riverside, and a series of numbers that seemed to have been scratched off. Curiosity gnawed at James. Who had this puppy belonged to? How had it ended up alone in the snow? And why was the address incomplete? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he could see. As he sat pondering, the puppy let out a soft back as if urging him to act. James nodded. "All right, little one. Tomorrow we'll figure this out. For now, let's get you some rest." But as James lay in bed that night, the faint engraving on the tag lingered in his mind. It felt like the start of a puzzle, one he couldn't ignore. The next morning, the snowstorm had eased, leaving behind a serene, white landscape. James bundled up the puppy, who seemed much livelier now, and headed toward Riverside Street. The address on the tag might have been incomplete, but it was a starting point. Riverside Street was on the outskirts of town, lined with old, weathered houses. Most of them looked abandoned, their windows boarded up and roofs sagging under the weight of years. As James walked, the puppy nestled in his arms. A sense of unease settled over him. The street was eerily quiet, with no signs of life. He reached the end of the street, where the houses became sparse. One, in particular, caught his attention. It was a crumbling, two-story house with ivy crawling up its sides and a gate hanging off its hinges. Something about it felt off. James hesitated but decided to investigate. The gate creaked loudly as he pushed it open, and the puppy let out a low whine. "It's okay, Hope," James said, trying to reassure both the puppy and himself. He approached the front door, which was slightly ajar. Inside, the house was cold and dark, the air thick with the smell of damp wood. James stepped inside cautiously, his boots crunching on debris scattered across the floor. The puppy squirmed in his arms, as if sensing something. In the corner of the room, James noticed a stack of old newspapers. Curiosity got the better of him, and he picked one up. The headline sent a chill down his spine. "Family disappears without a trace. Mystery surrounds Riverside street house." James's hands trembled as he read further. The article detailed the mysterious disappearance of the family that had lived in this very house nearly a decade ago. The case had gone cold, with no leads or suspects. James glanced at the puppy in his arms, his heart racing. Was this where Hope had come from? As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. Beneath the pile of newspapers was a trapdoor, its edges barely visible under the dust. James felt a surge of dread but couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity. He knelt down, brushing away the debris, and pulled the trapdoor open. What he saw made his blood run cold. The trapdoor revealed a dark, narrow staircase leading down into what appeared to be a basement. A faint, musty smell wafted up, making James gag. He hesitated, his mind racing with thoughts of what might lie below. The puppy let out a soft whimper, as if urging him to stop. But something compelled James to press on. Using the flashlight on his phone, he descended the stairs slowly. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, each sound echoing in the silence. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of strange, unidentifiable substances. A single table stood in the center, covered in dust and cobwebs. But what caught James's attention was a small, metal box tucked in the corner of the room. It looked out of place, its surface gleaming faintly despite the layer of dust. He approached it cautiously, his hands trembling as he reached out to open it. Inside the box was a stack of photographs, yellowed with age. James picked up the top one and froze. It was a picture of the family that had lived in the house, a man, a woman, and a young girl. But there was something strange about the photo. In the background, barely visible, was the silhouette of a figure standing in the shadows. James's pulse quickened as he flipped through the photos. In each one, the shadowy figure grew closer, its features becoming clearer. By the last photo, it was standing directly behind the family, its face twisted into a sinister grin. James's hands shook as he dropped the photos back into the box. He felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but as he turned to go, he noticed something else. Carved into the wall, just above the table, were the words, "She's waiting." James bolted up the stairs, clutching the puppy tightly. His mind raced as he tried to process what he had seen. Who was the shadowy figure? What had happened to the family? And why had the words, "She's waiting," been carved into the wall? Back in the safety of daylight, James felt a momentary sense of relief. But the questions gnawed at him, refusing to let go. He decided he needed answers. Whatever this mystery was, it was connected to Hope, and he couldn't abandon the puppy now. As he walked back toward town, he noticed a small library. It was old and unassuming, the kind of place most people overlooked. But James felt drawn to it. Maybe the library held records or information about the house on Riverside Street. Inside, the librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, greeted him. "Cold day to be out," she said with a warm smile. James nodded. "I'm looking for anything you have on Riverside Street. Specifically, the house at the end of the road." The librarian's smile faltered, and a shadow crossed her face. "That's an old story," she said quietly. "Not many people ask about that house anymore." James explained what he had found, leaving out the more unsettling details. The librarian listened intently before leading him to a dusty archive room. "If there's anything about that house, it'll be in here," she said. As James sifted through old records and newspapers, he began to piece together the story of the house. The family who had lived there had been happy, by all accounts, until strange occurrences began. Neighbors reported hearing cries and whispers late at night. Then, one day, the family vanished without a trace. The house had been abandoned ever since. But one detail stood out. The family had a dog, a small, white puppy. James's heart skipped a beat as he looked down at Hope, now asleep in his arms. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was far from comforting. And James couldn't shake the feeling that the mystery was far from over. The faint hum of the library's fluorescent lights seemed to amplify James's racing thoughts as he pored over the fragile records. The details about the family, the Thompsons, were haunting. But what struck him most was their dog's eerie resemblance to Hope. Could it be the same dog? It didn't seem possible. Yet, as he traced his fingers over the faded photograph of the puppy, the thought lingered. James leaned back, his eyes scanning the room for answers that weren't there. He had uncovered whispers of a tragedy, but there were still too many blanks. The librarian returned, her arms full of books and folders. "I thought these might help," she said, placing them on the table. Her voice was tinged with hesitation. "Some of these are old personal accounts of the area. People talked a lot about the Thompsons when it happened." James nodded his thanks and began flipping through the documents. Most of it was repetitive, neighbors reporting screams, strange lights in the house, and then nothing. But one entry caught his eye. It was a diary excerpt from a teenage boy who had lived next door to the Thompsons. October 14th, 2010. "Something's wrong at the Thompsons' house. I saw Mrs. Thompson in the yard this morning. She looked scared, kept looking over her shoulder like someone was following her. Later, I heard her yelling. It wasn't an argument. It sounded like she was screaming at no one. That night, I swear I saw a shadow move past their window. But it wasn't a person. It was too tall, too thin. I'm not sleeping tonight." Jamesy's pulse quickened. The description of the shadow matched the figure in the photographs he'd found in the house. What had been haunting the Thompsons? And why did it seem to connect to Hope? The librarian interrupted his thoughts. "There's one more thing," she said, holding out an envelope. "This was found near the house after the family disappeared. It's never been opened." James took the envelope carefully, the paper brittle with age. The handwriting on the front was neat but urgent, for those who seek the truth. His hand shook as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled hastily. "It's not the house. It's what's under it." James left the library with hope nestled against his chest, the cryptic message replaying in his mind. "It's not the house. It's what's under it." What could that mean? The trapdoor had already led him to the unsettling basement. Was there something deeper beneath the surface? Determined to uncover the truth, James returned to the Riverside Street house. The sight of the dilapidated structure sent a shiver down his spine, but he pushed past his fear. This time, he came prepared with a flashlight, gloves, and a crowbar. Hope let out a small bark as if encouraging him forward. Inside, the air was colder than before, and the silence felt oppressive. James made his way to the trapdoor and descended the stairs. The basement was just as he'd left it, with the strange jars lining the shelves and the eerie words carved into the wall. But now he noticed something he hadn't before, a faint draft coming from the corner of the room. James shined his flashlight in the direction of the draft and saw a crack in the floorboards. Heart pounding, he used a crowbar to pry up the boards. Beneath them was a hidden passageway, a dark tunnel leading further underground. The air that wafted up was damp and earthy, carrying a faint metallic scent. Taking a deep breath, James stepped into the tunnel, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The walls were lined with old, crumbling bricks, and the ground was uneven. As he walked, he noticed strange symbols etched into the walls. symbols he didn't recognize but that filled him with unease. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually, it opened up into a cavernous room. At the center of the room was an ancient stone altar, its surface covered in strange carvings. Surrounding it were small piles of bones, animal bones. By the looks of them, James's stomach churned. Before he could process what he was seeing, Hope began to bark furiously, her tiny body trembling in his arms. James turned to see a shadow move across the far wall. It wasn't his shadow. It was something else. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. The shadow was tall and spindly, its movements unnatural. It seemed to ripple and shift as it glided along the wall, growing closer with each passing second. Hope squirmed in his arms, her barking frantic. "Stay calm," James whispered, though his voice shook. He backed away slowly, his flashlight trained on the shadow. But the light seemed to have no effect. The shadow remained, dark and menacing. Suddenly, a deep, guttural voice echoed through the cavern, though there was no visible source. "Why have you come?" it growled. The sound reverberated in James's chest, making his knees weak. James's mind raced. I found a puppy," he stammered. "Hope. She led me here." The shadow paused, its form shifting as if considering his words. "The dog is a key," it said finally. "But you should not be here." "What happened to the Thompsons?" James demanded, summoning what little courage he had. "What are you?" The shadow let out a low, chilling laugh. "The Thompsons. They tried to banish me, but they failed. They were mine, as you will be." James's grip on Hope tightened as the shadow surged toward him. Acting on instinct, he swung the flashlight at the figure. To his surprise, the beam of light caused the shadow to recoil, its form dissolving slightly at the edges. Realizing the light could hurt it, James shone the flashlight directly at the shadow, driving it back. "Stay away!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the cavern. The shadow hissed, retreating into the darkness. "You cannot escape me," it snarled. "This is not over." As the shadow disappeared, James wasted no time. He turned and ran back through the tunnel, Hope barking in his arms. The journey back to the surface felt like an eternity, but finally, he emerged into the basement, slamming the trapdoor shut behind him. Back in his apartment, James tried to make sense of what he'd encountered. The shadow's words echoed in his mind. "The dog is a key." What did that mean? And how was Hope connected to the Thompsons and the malevolent presence beneath their house? Feeling overwhelmed, James decided he couldn't face this alone. He needed help. He reached out to an old friend, Sarah, who had a background in folklore and paranormal studies. They hadn't spoken in years, but if anyone could make sense of this, it was her. Sarah arrived later that evening, her curiosity piqued by James's frantic phone call. "You're telling me you found a haunted house, a shadow creature, and a mysterious puppy," she said, raising an eyebrow. "I know it sounds crazy," James admitted, "but I'm not making this up. Look at this." He showed her the photographs, the diary entry, and the note from the envelope. Sarah's skepticism faded as she examined the evidence. "This is unsettling," she said finally. "The symbols in the tunnel and the altar suggest some kind of ritualistic activity. The shadow you describe might be a manifestation of something ancient and powerful. And if it's tied to the dog, what do we do?" James asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Sarah's expression hardened. "We need to go back. If the dog is the key, we need to figure out what it unlocks. But we'll need more than just a flashlight." The next morning, James and Sarah began preparing for their return to the house. Sarah brought equipment, candles, protective charms, and a book of ancient rituals. She also insisted on bringing her dog, Max, a large German shepherd with a protective nature. "Animals are more sensitive to the supernatural," Sarah explained. "If anything happens, Max will sense it before we do." James felt a mix of anxiety and determination. Hope seemed unusually calm, as if she knew they were about to face something important. As they packed their gear, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. When they arrived at the house, the air felt heavier, as though the house itself was alive and aware of their presence. The three of them entered cautiously, Max growling low in his throat. "Let's find out what the shadow meant by the dog being the key," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Together, they descended into the basement and opened the trapdoor. The darkness below seemed deeper this time, almost tangible. But James knew there was no turning back. With Hope in his arms and Sarah by his side, he stepped into the unknown, ready to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The chill of the underground tunnel seemed even colder this time. James, Sarah, and their dogs, Hope and Max, walked cautiously, their flashlights illuminating the narrow path. The carvings on the walls felt more sinister now, as if they pulsed with a malevolent energy. James's heart raced as a group pressed deeper into the darkness. Sarah stopped abruptly and pointed to a carving that stood out from the rest. It was a large circular symbol, intricate and almost hypnotic. In the center was a depiction of a dog, eerily resembling Hope. Beneath it, an inscription read, "The Protector opens the way." "This has to mean something," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hope isn't just a puppy. She's connected to this place in ways we don't fully understand." Max growled low in his throat, and Sarah placed a calming hand on his back. James knelt to examine the symbol more closely, running his fingers over the grooves. Suddenly, Hope let out a sharp bark and jumped from his arms. She ran ahead, her small form disappearing into the shadows. "Hope!" James shouted, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Without hesitation, he ran after her, the others close behind. The tunnel opened into another chamber, even larger than the first. At the center was a circular platform surrounded by glowing stones. Hope stood on the platform, barking frantically. As James approached, he noticed something horrifying. The shadowy figure from before was materializing, its form becoming more distinct with each passing second. "Stay back," Sarah yelled, holding up a protective charm. The shadow hissed, its shape twisting unnaturally, but it didn't retreat this time. Instead, it spoke. "The key has returned," it said, its voice like gravel scraping against metal. "You cannot stop what has begun." James's mind raced. What did the shadow mean? And what was Hope's role in all of this? Sarah's hands trembled as she flipped through her book of rituals. "There has to be something here that can help," she muttered. The shadow circled the platform, its dark tendrils reaching out like claws. Max barked ferociously, standing protectively in front of Sarah. "James, bring Hope here," Sarah instructed. "I think she's the only one who can activate this altar." James hesitated, glancing between Hope and the shadow. The puppy seemed unafraid, her small body vibrating with energy. Finally, he scooped her up and placed her on the platform. As soon as her paws touched the surface, the glowing stones flared brighter, and the carvings on the walls lit up with an otherworldly light. The shadow let out an ear-piercing screech. "You fools!" it roared. "You don't understand what you're awakening." James and Sarah exchanged a panicked look. "What does it mean?" James asked. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but we don't have a choice. Whatever's happening, we have to see it through." The ground beneath them began to shake, and the platform rose slowly, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an ancient artifact, a small, intricately carved box. Sarah reached for it, but as her fingers brushed the surface, the shadow surged forward, its form growing larger and more menacing. "Don't let it touch the box," Sarah screamed. James grabbed the box and held it close, shielding it from the shadow. Hope's barking grew louder, almost deafening. The puppy's eyes glowed with an ethereal light, and the shadow recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. Back in the safety of James's apartment, the group examined the box. It was made of dark wood, with silver inlays forming the same circular symbol they had seen in the tunnel. The air around it felt charged, as though the box contained something immensely powerful. "We need to open it," Sarah said, though her voice wavered. "But we have to be careful. This could be dangerous." James hesitated. What if opening it makes things worse? And what if it's the only way to stop that thing? Sarah countered. James sighed, then carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a single, glowing crystal. Its light was mesmerizing, and the room seemed to vibrate with energy as they stared at it. "This is it," Sarah whispered. "This is what the shadow was after." Before James could respond, the room grew cold, and the lights flickered. The shadow had returned, its presence filling the space with a suffocating darkness. "Give it to me," it demanded, its voice a terrifying roar. James held the crystal tightly, its warmth contrasting with the cold air around him. "No," he said firmly. "You've caused enough pain. This ends now." The shadow laughed, a sound that sent chills down their spines. "You cannot stop me," it said. "I am eternal." Sarah quickly flipped through her book, searching for a banishment spell. "James, hold the crystal over the altar," she instructed. "We need to channel its energy." The group had brought the artifact back to the altar beneath the house, knowing it was the only place strong enough to contain the shadow's power. James placed the crystal on the altar, and Sarah began chanting the incantation. The air crackled with energy as the shadow screamed in fury, its form distorting violently. Hope stood on the altar beside the crystal, her small body glowing with the same light. Max growled and lunged at the shadow, his bravery inspiring James and Sarah to continue. As Sarah's chanting reached its climax, the shadow let out a final, ear-splitting shriek and was sucked into the crystal. The room fell silent. Days later, the house on Riverside Street was quiet once more. The trapdoor had been sealed, and the crystal was locked away, far from anyone who might misuse its power. James and Sarah sat in his living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. "Do you think it's really over?" James asked. Sarah nodded slowly. "For now, but we'll need to keep an eye on the crystal. Its power is too great to be ignored." Hope and Max lay at their feet, finally at peace. James stroked Hope's fur, marveling at how much the tiny puppy had changed his life. As they prepared to move on, James turned to the camera he had set up to document their journey. "Thank you for joining us on this unbelievable adventure," he said, addressing the audience. "We faced unimaginable dangers, but we also discovered the incredible bond between humans and animals. Hope wasn't just a puppy. She was a hero." He smiled and leaned closer to the camera. "What do you think the shadow really was? And what would you have done if you were in our shoes? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. And remember, sometimes the smallest creatures can make the biggest difference." As the video ended, Hope barked softly, as if bidding the audience farewell. The mystery of Riverside Street might have been solved, but the memories would last forever.